Welcome, my friends, to the Sage of Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my guest is occult researcher Michael Joseph. In this show, Michael will take us through how he believes the occultist or adept views and applies their esoteric practices. To do this, Michael will delineate between adept occultism and orthodox Christianity. Due to the complexity of the material presented, it is recommended to watch the slideshow as we make our way through the discussion in order to fully understand Michael's explanations and insights. Michael makes no claim that his research or interpretations on this topic are definitive or absolute. He is simply offering his insights based upon his research. The topic of the occult is complex, and there will be different schools of thought on meaning and application of this knowledge. That being said, this presentation is an excellent primer on occult symbolism. And so without further ado, here's the conversation with Michael Joseph. Well, Michael, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to come on to the show. I just want to level set the audience a little bit. Michael, you had written me an email after watching my show with Sophia Smallstone where I talked about Paul is Dead and William Shepard. And during that show, I had mentioned that in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, that Bill Shepard essentially spelled it out for everybody that he's an occultist and he's into mysticism and he's into the esoteric and so on. And then you wrote me an email and you had really detailed out and given me a lot more information with regard to the occult and the karmic numbers and the tarot card meanings behind Paul's birth and his death and a lot of other information, and it was very, very impressive. But this show is not going to be about Paul is Dead. Probably a lot of my audience is probably saying, thank God, because I've done 2 shows on that already. But what I want to do is for you to present your research with regard to the occult, with regard to the esoteric, because what you and I have talked about offline, I think it's going to be a fabulous way for the audience to get a really good fundamental, let's say, occult 101 understanding based upon your research. Because there is a lot of misconceptions out there about a lot of stuff. We talk about occult symbolism, we talk about Aleister Crowley and so on. There's a lot of polarizing understandings out there. And I think that you're going to be able to kind of clear the table a little bit and hopefully get folks to understand a little bit more about these occultists, or some folks would refer to them as the elite class, the ruling class, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the secret societies. I mean, however they, in their head, they conjure up what that control mechanism is. What exactly is their point of view? How exactly do they look at the occult versus how we, which they refer to us as the profane, how we view it? And many of us don't even view it because we pay no attention to it. So I know it's a little long-winded, but Michael, I just want to thank you so much for coming on to the show and explaining this. And I just want to let the audience know too, Michael has been very gracious. He's prepared some slides, and my job is to do my job and just follow Michael's outline so that we can do this in a very controlled, systematic way so that we don't lose you or lose me on this topic. So, Michael, thank you so much. And I know you probably want to have a couple of words up front with regard to your research.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I definitely appreciate it. Yeah, basically, from my point of view, it's just I was doing a lot of research into these things after sort of waking up, I guess, probably 3 years or so after the Boston bombing. I started out just researching things on my own, just because I wanted to know. And then I started finding things that I thought people had some misconceptions about. So yeah, that's pretty much what I'm here to do, is just to show different sides of things that I found, show you some resources so that people can make up their own mind what they want to think about it. And all these, like you said, polarizing things where it's like people getting really upset about thinking this is bad, this is good, and vice versa. I'm just trying to present some things objectively so somebody can maybe make some more informed decisions about what they really think about that.
Okay, this is great, Michael. And the first slide is really a great slide to set this up. And I'm going to include these slides, obviously, in the show so that the audience can follow along. But your first slide is entitled Occult Themes to Keep in Mind. And I thought this was a wonderful slide to kind of get things kicked off. Did you want to take us through it?
Sure. This is just what I've come to understand as being some basics behind occult philosophy. And the first one is something that probably a lot of people are very familiar with already, is that there are exoteric or outer meanings. And this is for the mass of people, the quote unquote profane or the lower level initiates and whatnot. And then there's the esoteric or inner meanings for the adepts, basically. And this is explained in books by like Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike. Blavatsky talks about a lot of these things, Manly Palmer Hall, and, a bunch of other occult folks, figureheads. And the first thing I'd like to just sort of talk about those sources, and the reason why I kind of use them a lot is because they are important to the world. First and foremost, Madame Blavatsky, her teachings are being followed by the United Nations on some level through their spiritual foundation called Lucis Trust. And if you go to their website, they basically revere her in some way. Now, there's some people who follow Blavatsky's teachings that don't really like that. But either way, that's sort of one of the reasons why I think it's important to look at it, because there's fundamental ideas that are being enacted through that organization. Also, Albert Pike, just because he's sort of one of these Freemasons that's very well known. And Morals and Dogma is sort of like this, all-encompassing book on Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which is basically the esoteric Freemasonry. And he has a statue in Washington, D.C., as most people know. So obviously he must be pretty important. Aleister Crowley, obviously he's everywhere, and especially in the entertainment and pop culture. So those three sources are kind of what I'm using to draw upon, and then we can apply that. So what they view to be esoteric, that's sort of where I'm coming from. That's basically, something that the audience can get a sense of what I seem to think is esoteric. And maybe that's not. Maybe, the Vatican Library, they have all this secret stuff that we have no idea about. But my relation to it is that I'm just an average person looking at these things, trying to understand it. And I'm sure that's pretty much what the audience is. So I'm just trying to work together with people because we don't have access to all this fancy stuff, basically.
Yeah. And what's interesting, Michael, is you talk about Albert Pike, and he was a Confederate general, and they have a statue of him. I'm just making that comment because we're taught that the Confederacy during the Civil War was bad. And now we have a Confederate general. He's held in very high esteem in the world of Freemasonry.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this when we talked before, how, when it was all the rage to want to ban Confederate flag and Gone with the Wind or all that stuff, there's a lot of hype around that. I think it was one of those so-called shootings.
Yep.
And nobody mentioned getting rid of Albert Pike statues. So, I just think that's ironic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can move on to the next one. Being initiated into the mysteries, as far as I know, is obtaining knowledge of the highest God, or gnosis. This is the God that's above the demiurge, and this is the creator God of the material world. And this process is kind of known as lifting the veil of Isis. And we can get into some reasons why this veil and Isis idea is popular and what that might mean. But basically, this lesser demiurgic God, I think it's actually the demiurge. It's a Greek word, I think, but I just say demiurge. It's just the way I'm accustomed to saying it. But
I do too.
Yeah. This figure is known as Ealdabaoth in Gnosticism, and he's known as this lion serpent. Saturn, according to Blavatsky, especially Samael, which I think means the blind one. So he's blind, that he thinks he's the highest God, but he's blind to this other higher world above him. And this is basically Jehovah or Yahweh of the Old Testament. And moving forward, I'll just probably say the demiurge or Jehovah, just to keep it simple. Most people can just easily recognize Jehovah as, the Old Testament God, right?
Right.
And so this is the creator of the material world. And so that is who is viewed as not being so good in Gnosticism. And there's a lot of different viewpoints on Gnosticism, and there's a chapter in Morals and Dogma where Albert Pike just goes through like all the different versions of it. I can't remember exactly. I think it's the Knight of the Sun, Prince Adept. The Scottish Trinitarian. There's just all these different versions of Gnosticism, and it gets pretty wild. So some don't view the demiurge as necessarily bad, but he's not the highest, and good can be exercised through him, but he's just completely unaware of these things. So basically, it's kind of like an ignorant at best, hostile at worst relationship kind of thing with him. But that's the essence of it.
I know we'll get into this, but there are many major religions that worship the demiurge then.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the viewpoint of the occult, is that all the exoteric religions, in some way or another, even atheism from their viewpoint, because it's exalting the material world, right? It's like there's only the material and that's it. And Albert Pike has a lot of not so good things to say about atheists in Morals and Dogma. Basically, base or material or earthly desires, this is seen as being in duality. And so you can see the Masonic checkerboard here. This is taken from the movie The Matrix, which is laden with occult symbolism. And, you know, in the second Matrix, when Neo's having the conversation with the Grand Architect, that's seen as like the demiurgic figure, kind of. And so, you know, whenever you see this checkerboard, that's basically, in my opinion, representing duality, the dualistic creation. You know, man can be good at one moment or really bad at another. And that's sort of you know, basically the essence of the demiurge. He created out of the sin of pride because he believed himself to be the highest God. So there's a corruption there. And the further down you go into the material, the more dark and in darkness it will get, essentially. And then the process of alchemy is sort of uniting this force, or this spark, you should call it the divine spark, above the demiurge to bring to the below creation of the material world. And this is the idea of turning Saturnian lead, like people talked about Saturn. And, you know, like I said, that was one of the names of the demiurge. So this is the, you know, the creator, the material realm, and turning that into spiritual gold. So the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, corresponds to this.
Now, Michael, there are some out there that will say that and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but this just came to mind. There are those in the ruling class, it's claimed that they worship Saturn. I mean, what do we say about that? Because that would mean that they're worshiping the demiurge, or do they not worship Saturn?
Yeah, this is a strange question, because this is, when I was researching a lot of this, I was sort of, you know, watching all these videos about, you know, the black cube and all this stuff. And I don't want to get too much into that, but to me, black is the color of Saturn. And if you read all of the literature that we look at, Blavatsky, Pike, and whatever, it seems pretty obvious to me that they absolutely don't like the demiurge or the material creation. I mean, that's just a basic 101 to them. So if it's a perversion of it, then we would see the symbolism of it. But I think from the symbolism that we see in like events like 9/11 and also the astrology in it, and that's something that maybe for another time we can get into something like that. But I just don't see it. I see that as sort of being this exoteric thing. And this is what I think is interesting. If you're looking at it from an adept occultist point of view, and you think that the profane all worship the black cube on some level, then if you have, you know, let's just say, for an example, there's like Orthodox Christians who are kind of viewing the New World Order as, you know, bad, satanic, and whatnot. But they're also saying that the black cube represents Satan and that the elites are worshiping that. From the viewpoint of adept occultists, since they think Orthodox Christians worship the demiurge, they're just blaspheming their own God from their viewpoint. So I think they might find that sort of like, kind of like laughable or amusing, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these things that go on that I think are very interesting when you look at it from the perspective of adept occultism as we read it in Blavatsky and Crowley and whatnot. And if you apply that to the world, I think that a lot of the conflict between people is sort of arising from some of these misconceptions. And that's the reason I'm even out there and putting myself out there to begin with, is because I just hate seeing people argue with each other in the truther movement about all these things that I'm looking at. I'm like, oh my God, like this is so ridiculous. And I'm hoping that anything that I share, it might resonate with some people to look at things a little bit differently and maybe not be so hostile towards the common man.
Yeah. One of the reasons, Michael, I think that it's great that you're here is because you talk about the truth movement or the alternative research community. And this stuff where they try to explain the esoteric, they try to explain the occult, I mean, it's all over the map.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that I get very frustrated with. I try to, do my research and try to understand this stuff as much as I can. And, as I dig deeper and deeper into it, I find that it's exactly that. It's all over the place. So hopefully with this show, we'll be able to kind of baseline this thing a little bit and see if we can get people to view it from a more objective perspective, if you will. That's really, I think, what the goal is here. Now, Michael, on the right-hand side of the chart, you have the Masonic compass and square.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something also that people just look at that and they just believe that it's all evil. And I was wondering if maybe you could explain that a little bit. You have your words there. And folks, again, this will be in the slideshow. You have the compass meaning above, the spiritual, the sun, and then the square meaning below, material, and the moon. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, kind of traditionally, the sun is seen as the divine in the heavens, and then the moon is seen as being in relation to earth. And so that's basically what the compass means. That's the divine. And it's not the physical sun. It's an allegory. And this is another sort of misconception. This is why if you worship the physical sun, you're worshiping like the physical creation. So that's still sort of the demiurge. And the sun, especially in like astrology, is sort of representative of the ego. So if you have a false ego, you're trying to purge that in the occult. And so the demiurge has the false ego, right? So you can see the connection here. And so the spiritual sun is this spiritual concept or idea about it. So that's one little thing I'd like to differentiate from what I've read. They call it the concealed sun. And then below, the square represents Earth. Obviously, the moon, goddess, Mother Earth, these sorts of connotations, basically having to do with man. And Albert Pike basically lays this out in Morals and Dogma. And real quick, I can just read a quick quote where he says, "The square is an instrument adapted for plane surfaces only, and therefore appropriate to geometry or measurement of the Earth, which appears to be and was by the ancients supposed to be a plane." So he's just saying that the ancients are saying that the Earth is supposed to be a plane, like flat Earth, right?
Right.
And so that's what the square is representative of. And then he says, "The compass is an instrument that has relation to spheres and spherical surfaces and is adapted to spherical trigonometry, or that branch of mathematics which deals with the heavens and the orbits of the planetary bodies." So the above, right? So interesting, he's relating spheres to the compass and the above, and we're told that we're on a sphere Earth, right?
Right.
So I think that's kind of interesting that this whole flat Earth debate, which, I'm not going to say that I am a flat earther or something like that, but I've looked at a lot of that stuff and I find it very interesting. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners are already involved in that. So there's a direct sort of reference, and this is page 850 in Morals and Dogma. So I think that that's very interesting, and you can see that sort of described on the compass and square.
That's very interesting. Very interesting, Michael. Now, one of the other debate points that I have bumped up against is the G. What does the G mean? Now, when I was reading Memoirs of Billy Shears, and I'm trying to tell folks that in that book, William Shepard is, he's knee deep as a Freemason, very high level Mason. And in the book, he says that he explains that the G in Freemasonry represents God, geometry, and gatekeeper. So does that make any sense to you, or have you come up with a different definition?
Yeah, to me, the G has multiple meanings to it. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And even Albert Pike talks about how there's many layers of symbolism. It's just, even if something is an esoteric meaning, it could mean all these different things. You just sort of got to find an application for it. And to me, in my personal opinion, these are some things I've come across. I like to relate it to numbers. So the Hebrew letter Gimel, which is the English equivalent of G, is associated with that. It's a value of 3. So you could put a 3 there if you'd like. So, 3 being like a trinity, or the 3 pillars, which we'll talk about. And then also G is the 7th letter of the alphabet. So 7, you could just throw a 7 in there. So, 7 being a divine number and all this stuff. And I'll just really quickly relate it to the JFK assassination. That's one of my main themes I have on YouTube. The license plate GG300, you could see that as being 33 300 or 77 300 by applying that I just spoke about, right? So if you add those together, it's 10, and there are 10 spheres on the tree of life, and basically the 0 is kind of known as deity, and then the 1 is sort of like bridging the above and below. So it's like man standing next to God. So, like kind of like the binary code, things like that. So you could do all these number things with it that are very interesting. But, G, just, it could be gnosis, right? Knowledge of the highest God, lifting the veil. And you have this gnosis that there's a world above the demiurge. Could be geometry, could be God. There's all these different things. And so I think it's probably all of them on some level. It's just where you want to apply it to and what you're applying it to, which would make the connection to it.
Okay. So it sounds like that, well, at least from our discussion point here, that there's no just one definition of the G. As I said, in my research, I would find different meanings, and I would be scratching my head trying to figure out, well, what does the G mean, So
I hear you. I feel the same way. Like I look at some of these things and then I'll read something, I'm like, oh my God, I was so wrong about all these other things I was talking about. So it's a learning process, and that's what I'm trying to convey. This is where I'm coming from. I'm not saying that those are the meanings or not.
Yeah. Maybe
in like the super secret high up Vatican halls, they think the G is something completely different. I don't know,
Right.
So, like I said, I'm not trying to, ruffle any feathers here. This is just where I'm coming from. And if I'm making application that makes sense to people, or hopefully that sparks other people's ideas of like, oh, wait, maybe it can mean that. So that's my whole thing. Just maybe this can bring out some ideas from other people as well.
Yeah, like as mentioned in the beginning of the show, you're presenting your research, and as I always do with my audience, Michael, if somebody has something they want to add to what it is that we're talking about, maybe there's a blank that they want to fill in, then they should email me, and and I'll share it with you, and you and I can look at it, and we can bring it in if we need to, if that's what we need to do. Did you want to move to the next slide?
Yes, might as well.
Okay, all right. So this is a great slide, and you have broken the slide down essentially into two categories, Michael: adept occultism and orthodox Christianity, and then to the far left we have the concept or the character, and I read this slide this morning, and I thought it was fantastic. So why don't you take us through these, the concepts and the characters, so that the audience can get an understanding or a differentiation between what Jesus means as an example from an adept occultism perspective versus Orthodox Christianity. We can go right down the line.
Okay. First, I'm just going to say that these are kind of guidelines. There's so many different viewpoints and all this stuff, so I don't want to ruffle any feathers again. This is just what I'm getting from it. And one more further point. I have references for all of these things in my own videos on YouTube. So I'll have a link to give you that you can put in the video description, and people can go to that, click on it, and I'll have a whole list of where they can sort of expand upon these things and where I'm getting this information from, basically.
What's your channel name, Michael?
Schism 206, like the Tool song. Yeah, so, and it's pretty fitting. There's a split here, right?
Right.
Anyways, so I can just go in explaining these things from what I've gathered. So Jesus Christ, that's something that's obviously very controversial. From what I gather in adept occultism, Jesus is good. Where you place him on the hierarchy, sometimes he's the visible representation of the Father or the highest God, which is very much in line with Orthodox Christianity. But basically, he's like this mediator between man and the divine. And that is his function in Orthodox Christianity as well. But the difference is that in adept occultism, where he is sort of varies, or it's sort of like he's not like a physical being. It's a concept. It's an allegory. And people hear of like Christ consciousness. And so this is sort of like the spark of divinity within you in relation to Jesus in the book of Revelation, and especially the Gospel of John. And so the adept occultism, it's a lot more conceptual. There are some aspects that you can relate to physical in certain branches of Gnosticism, but for the most part, it's a spiritual being. It's a spiritual concept. Now, if you go to the Orthodox side, Jesus Christ is God. He's the creator of everything, and his essence is sort of merged with the Father, and then the Holy Spirit is sort of like the spirit that is given to man to basically know of God and all these things. You have all these concepts like being born again of the Spirit and all this stuff. The idea in most Orthodox Christianity is that, the entire Bible is the Spirit of God or the Holy Spirit that wrote it through man, and that was God's will, basically. So, but the most important thing is Jesus was a physical incarnation, was God incarnate, and sacrificed himself for the sins of humanity so that humanity could have eternal life. And, again, Orthodox Christianity will debate all day about all these little logistics about these things, but to me, that's the basic essence of it. So if we go to Jehovah or Yahweh, this is where the contradistinction happens. So obviously, adept occultism views him as the demiurge. He creates the material world out of ego, basically, thinking he's the highest God. On Orthodox Christianity side, Jehovah is the highest God. He's the Father that Christ speaks of in the New Testament. But he is also outside of creation. He's just the creator of it. And the reason the world is in duality basically has to do with Lucifer or Satan. It's not because of the highest God. So it's weird because there's a lot of parallels between these two viewpoints, and it's really convoluted. And like you had mentioned to me before, one of your guests talks about Lucifer. What was her name? Priscilla?
Priscilla, yeah.
Yeah, just sort of this idea that like Lucifer is Jesus or the morning star and all this stuff. Again, I don't want to make a definitive distinction between the two, but it's something that's just very easy to get kind of drawn in one side or the other because it's so ambiguous, in my opinion. So that's kind of the distinction. That's the big one. Who is Jesus Christ's father? In Gnosticism, his father, if we go to the next one, is this highest God above Jehovah. This is especially the viewpoint of Madame Blavatsky. And this father, this highest God above Jehovah, is basically androgynous. It's the perfect union of the masculine and feminine essence. So it's impersonal. It's not anthropomorphic. It doesn't have like human emotions or human qualities. Anything that's human is basically profane or has duality to it. Now, again,
this is interesting, Michael, because as you're describing this, I'm thinking to myself in terms of transhumanism, androgyny. We see a lot of those themes today. I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm wondering if that is tied into the adept occultists' view of Jesus Christ as Father. In other words, it's not anthropomorphic, it's impersonal. Well, you have this androgynous transhumanism type of an agenda. Now, I don't know, whether you want to comment on that. I'm just sharing what my thoughts are as you're going through this.
Yeah, I've definitely made that connection many times. I don't really understand it completely. But one thing I do find interesting is the process of alchemy between it, because the twin pillars of duality, the dark and the light pillar, we haven't talked about the middle pillar yet. That's the masculine and the feminine pillar. So if you're taking the sexes and they're divided, you're unifying them into one, and that's the process of alchemy, basically.
Yeah.
So you can make that application for sure. The reasons why that's out there and it's so prominent, I don't know exactly, but there's definitely a connection. And if we move on to the Orthodox side, basically Jehovah is masculine. It's the father. It's a paternal essence. And in most views, this is a personal being. And Jesus Christ is a personal being. So they have emotions. So those are the human-like qualities associated with him, but they're, the perfect emanation of that, basically. So those are the main differences that I've found. Now, some people on the Orthodox side sometimes try to say Jehovah is not really anthropomorphic, but we are cognizant of him through that. There's a lot of convolution that can happen on both sides of it. And like I said, sometimes I don't know if I'm reading something that's Gnostic or Orthodox. It's really hard to decide.
Yeah.
Because there's so many viewpoints. So now if we go into Satan, which is probably the biggest area of controversy, basically, from what I've gathered on the adept occultist side, is that this is the negative polarity of the dualistic demiurge and his creation. So basically, this is sort of related to the archons, also man's sinful nature. So they want to keep you in the material realm. They want to be your God, basically. So they're going to do everything they can to try to prevent you from knowing of this higher God above them. Or, like some say, they're just ignorant of it, and therefore they become evil. And so this dualism, Satan would basically be Jehovah, but it's not that he's completely bad. It's just that his negative side creates evil. See what I'm saying?
Okay, so in other words, it sounds like, let's see if I've got this right. It sounds like that Jehovah would have duality. He would have a dual personality.
Yeah, and if you go to the Old Testament, I think there's a lot of people will probably understand that viewpoint, because it's like Jehovah gets very angry, is smiting everything and all this stuff, and then he's forgiving and loving. Jehovah's angry at Israel. Now he's happy with Israel and stuff like that. Now, Orthodox would view that as being, well, anybody who's punished was deserving of it. And this gets into a lot of like the Nephilim and the corruption of bloodlines and stuff. And that's something that I'm not going to really touch upon, because that's just a whole nother topic. But
yeah,
there is an Orthodox response to that. And to me, it's just sort of like when people say that the Bible is the literal word of God and everything in the Old Testament is somehow righteous, I can't go down that road, because there's some messed up stuff there, in my opinion. But at the same time, that could be, in my opinion, sort of the bait to bring people to the other side of it. It's kind of like what happens to a lot of people, this polarity. I'll just touch upon this concept. It's sort of like somebody might grow up in an Orthodox Christian household where they're just constantly told, you're sinful, you need to find Jesus, and basically just traumatizing a kid. And I know a lot of people in my personal life that have had upbringings like this. So naturally, that kind of leads them to being either very atheistic or end up getting into a lot of like, I don't know, I don't want to say new agey type stuff, but also maybe sort of occult stuff. And those two can be mutually exclusive. Like, it depends on what you view as really being new age. But, and then some people will get into new age stuff, and then they think that it's all bad because they look at the Orthodox side and they think that that's Satan's deception. So then they jump on the other side of it. So in my opinion, people kind of get on polarities here. And I find that very suspicious with this idea of polarities and polarizing people and alchemy. And to me, it seems like maybe there's this idea that there are people manipulating these viewpoints to polarize people, but there's some plan to unify them somewhere down the line.
Okay.
So anyways, sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but
no. Keep going. No, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah. So there you go. Satan is sort of like this dualistic nature. And now on the right side, the Orthodox Christian viewpoint, from what I gather, Satan is the most perfect and beautiful created being. So he was created by Jehovah or Christ, whatever you want to view them as. But because he was so magnificent and awesome, he was corrupted by his own pride of that and thought that he was basically greater or higher than God, or should be the one in charge. So that's that viewpoint. Now, if we go to Lucifer, this is where you can start making some distinctions. Adept occultism will view Lucifer as very different from Satan. Lucifer is of the highest spiritual divinity and is above the demiurge and non-dualistic, and that's especially in Blavatsky's viewpoint. And we can maybe get into a couple quotes on that later.
Okay.
And so this is why the idea of Lucifer is revered amongst Eliphas Levi, Albert Pike, and also Crowley on some level. And there's a lot of debate around this, but basically Lucifer is good in the viewpoint of adept occultism on some level, because it is the enlightener of man. If you look at on Orthodox Christian side, it's basically just the same as Satan. He wants to be the highest God, and he's a master deceiver, so he's going to do everything he can to pull you away from this highest God. So Orthodox Christianity, for obvious reasons, views everything about the occult, about, spiritual enlightenment and whatnot, and is, basically aligning with the highest divinity. That's just one big lie to them, basically. And so, like I said, this is where you can see, obviously, how polarizing these viewpoints can bring out some nasty stuff in people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very polarizing. I'm looking at this, and it's Satan and Lucifer, most of the time, by most people, is used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
And on your chart, it's showing that with adept occultism, that's the furthest thing from the truth.
Right. And so, to me, I think it's more important to focus on what are the actual methodologies of what is not good. So if you're going to say, okay, Satan, that name just represents things that are bad. I think, one way you can kind of bridge the gap in all these things is just define with people what you think is actually bad. Instead of arguing, well, this name is what's really good or this name was really bad, you're not really focusing on the core issue. You know what I mean? I think that's by design.
Yeah.
So we can get into some passages later that will sort of help maybe do that. But
so, Michael, if somebody says that something is satanic, in other words, it's always a term that's used to reflect something that's bad, dark, evil. So they're engaged in satanic behavior, satanic rituals. So from an adept occultism perspective, would that say that that person's involved in negative stuff?
Yeah, that would be black magic, basically. And, obviously people would, we'll get into some viewpoints later, but the whole idea of a lot of the things you hear about, messed up rituals and child sacrifice and all that stuff, that to me, there's dangers of getting too far into thinking that that's just everywhere, but also you can't negate that, there's enough things going around where people talk about that. So, I'm sort of in the middle with all those sorts of things. But to me, from an adept occultist point of view, literally sacrificing babies would just be an awful thing.
Right.
Anyways, that's sort of where I get, and, satanic would be your own egoic desires, because the demiurge, if he's creating out of ego and we're just sort of like this, lower more in the material realm version of that. And the further down you go into the material or your own egoic desires, that's going to breed darkness. And that's sort of what black magic is. So when you said in the Billy Shears interview where he sort of like used Satanism sometimes to his benefit.
Yeah.
To me, that would be like maybe he wanted some material gains or something. And he just sort of, maybe performed some black magic rituals. I don't know. That's just my assumption on it.
Right.
So, and, when he says like the Stones were flat out Satanists or whatever, maybe that just means that they just, they're kind of, from his viewpoint, I'm not saying the Rolling Stones are this, but,
that's like what he had said in the book. He said that they were satanic. That's
so maybe they're just, they're more into like, getting a lot of girls and, licking money and flashy things, stuff like that. That to me is all that would really mean. But again, I don't know what he meant by that, but from that perspective, that's what I would assume.
Okay. And then when people say that this is a Luciferian agenda, we hear that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So the Luciferian agenda as a negative would be applicable to the Orthodox Christianity view of Lucifer.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in the eye of the beholder, really.
They would look at that and say, what would they say? If you called them a Luciferian, what would they say?
Well, here's the thing. This comes back to the exoteric and esoteric, where Madame Blavatsky says that if Lucifer is demonized and seen as this dualistic, like tempter of man or redeemer kind of modality, that's just exoteric. It means that you're on the profane level of consciousness.
And profane meaning the unknowing.
Yeah. So from that viewpoint, if there's a lot of people saying that there's this Luciferian agenda, and let's just say for the sake of argument that the elites view people saying that, well, they're just talking about the dualistic Lucifer. They don't really understand. So, whatever, let them talk about it. Who cares? That's sort of my understanding of it. But like I said, it's really in the eye of the beholder. But these are the distinctions that I can come up with from the material.
I'm just asking these questions because you're piquing my interest. And I know we're going to get more into this, but I guess the audience can really start to get a flavor now for how these concepts or these characters could be interpreted, right? Because you have adept occultism and you have Orthodox Christianity. And Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, you probably have everything in between.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Great.
So it's a crazy world when you start looking at this stuff. And I really try to be very careful not to start judging people on their viewpoints on these things, because you don't really know why they say the things they do. Like, I don't really care if somebody says that they view Lucifer as good. My question is, well, what is this light that you're talking about? What are the how do you enact that? How do you treat people? Like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? I care about the substance behind it, not a name, basically.
Right, right.
So anyways, we can go through the rest of these. Sophia, this is interesting. Sophia has a lot of connections to the idea of Lucifer and the Gnostic point of view, especially from Blavatsky. So basically, Lucifer, the planet Venus, Sophia, the Holy Spirit, these are all kind of synonyms to each other for the most part. And so in Gnosticism, the basic idea is that she creates the demiurge, but it's sort of a mistake. She procreates without her divine consort, which would be Christ, because you hear about like Christ and Sophia.
Yes.
Like the Da Vinci Code, that's like a really exoteric version, in my opinion, of that story.
Yeah, John Lash explains this in his book, Not in His Image.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically that to me is from that point of view, and this has direct connections to the United Nations, which we'll go through later. That's sort of their viewpoint. Now, again, you can say that that's a perversion of it, or you can be suspicious that, okay, wait a second, is that a red flag that maybe there's something not right about all this? You know, that's for anybody to decide on their own. But to me, from the research, strictly speaking, that's what I've come up with.
Okay.
Now, to the right side of that, Sophia is not really mentioned in biblical theology as far as I know. So they'd probably just lump it into Lucifer being the bad, you know, Satan, Lucifer. It's the same thing. It's just this other deceptive, lying doctrine, basically.
Okay. I thought that Christianity referred to Sophia as a logos. Am I wrong there?
Not that as far as I know, I don't know of any Sophia in Orthodox Christianity.
Okay.
So when I mean Orthodox Christianity, there's a lot of folks that, you know, like pastors and stuff like that. People like Chuck Missler, J. Vernon McGee. And then on the conspiracy side of research, there's a lot of people out there. One person I really like from this perspective, just because of the information, is Dr. Michael Heiser. And he really clears up a lot of like grammar issues with the Bible and stuff like that. And, you know, he's an Orthodox Christian for sure. And if you're not into that, I still think that you really should check out that viewpoint to be objective about it, because I think he's got a lot of really interesting information. And, you know, that's sort of where I'm drawing from with a lot of this stuff, if anybody is curious. So anyways, we can move on to the Old Testament prophets. This is one of those areas of convolution. From what I can tell, is that all these prophets like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and even Moses, I think, is, you know, considered a prophet. Their stories are veiling these allegories of the highest God. So basically, you need to be, you know, initiated or be able to understand that they're actually revealing the God above the demiurge. They're not talking about Jehovah with their stuff, basically everything that they're saying. Now, on the Orthodox Christianity side, basically, they say that these prophets are revealing Jehovah's will, their Jehovah, their highest God, right, to Israel or God's people. And they are prophesizing literal events that will happen and stuff like that. They're not very popular because people are rebelling and being sinful. And so, you know, the prophets are telling them that bad things are going to happen to them if they don't straighten out, and they don't really heed the warning. So that's sort of the viewpoint there. It's weird because the idea of being sinful and, you know, self-indulgent is bad on both sides of this, basically. And so Moses, he's an interesting character. He's basically, you know, same as the prophets. He's veiling allegories of this highest God. So the perfect example of that is the golden calf story. And so from the adept occultist point of view, basically, when he finds the Israelites worshiping the golden calf and he's all mad about it, is they're worshiping one animal of the fixed signs of the zodiac, or the four creatures in the vision of Ezekiel, which is the ox or the calf, right? The eagle, the lion, the man. So these are all connected to astrology, where it's the man is Aquarius, the lion is Leo, the eagle is Scorpio, because the eagle is the symbol of Scorpio in antiquity. Now you think of it as the scorpion. And then the calf being Taurus. And so here's where things get kind of interesting, where if they're worshiping the golden calf, this is sort of like worshiping Taurus, but there are negative aspects of Taurus. So in astrology, Taurus is about finances, possessions, kind of materialistic sensuality, sexual lust, things like that. And this is like the symbolism of the bull. And this is where I differentiate a lot of things. People talk about gods like Moloch. The elites worship Moloch. There's a Moloch statue at Bohemian Grove and stuff like that. In my personal opinion, that's all exoteric. Moloch is a calf deity where they like would sacrifice their babies to it or something like that. And so, and there's even passages in Morals and Dogma where Albert Pike basically shits on Moloch, basically. So, this is where some of the misconceptions, I think, you have to address these things.
How about Baal? We hear about Baal all the time.
Yeah, to me, from what I can gather, is Baal is worshiping the sun, but it's sort of like the demiurgic sun, as far as I can tell. Basically, back to the story of Moses, he's like, oh God, these profane people are just immaterial desires. I'm angry. They don't deserve this enlightened knowledge. So that's kind of the idea of that, basically. And that's a really profound story because there's Pope Francis, he's going around saying a lot of things. He uses that analogy in some of his speeches or that he made when he, came over to the America, saying idolatry is taking over. People are worshiping the golden calf. And, to me, that's an occult invoking of saying people are worshiping materialism. They're being profane. So there's a lot of stuff with Pope Francis. I could do a whole show on him in the Vatican, but we'll take it easy here. But so basically that's that story. And he's revealing the highest God above Jehovah from that viewpoint. Now, if we go to the right side, Orthodox Christianity, it's basically the same idea. Like they're worshiping this idol and idolatry is bad. But still, the fact remains Jehovah is the highest God in that viewpoint.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll go to King David real quick. This is something I think is interesting because Blavatsky doesn't seem to think King David's the greatest. She basically says he's a Jehovah worshiper and therefore he's worshiping a false god. And Solomon, she kind of lumps into him with this. And Solomon's an interesting character because in the Bible, he turns from God, whichever God that is. I don't know. Take your pick, whichever viewpoint you want to go with it. But back to King David, she basically says that he's worshiping like a pagan protector deity that is Jehovah. And so he's basically being idolatrous. And this is where I think it gets interesting with the connection to the royal family, because there's a lot of people that have said that the royal family is the descendants of David. They're the Davidic throne. And there's this whole branch of Orthodox Christianity called the Lost Tribes of Israel. And people say that Great Britain and the USA are Ephraim and Manasseh, and they got all the blessings. And so basically that's why those are the most powerful countries. So it gets into all this weird stuff that does have some parallels. So to me, in my opinion, if you're going to view this from an adept occultist point of view, maybe the bloodline of David, if they believe that to be true, it's like they want to use that bloodline for their higher purposes. So they could view that as profane in a way. And to me, the only reason I make this connection is because when your guests, Bruce and Jamie, talked about the Jesuits and saying, oh, well, the Queen of England has to bow down to the Vatican before she goes anywhere in London or something like that. I can't remember. But
yeah, the inner city. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, that viewpoint sort of has some parallels I think are interesting where, a lot of people want to point the family at the royal bloodline and say that's where it ends. That's the elites, right? And, that's a very popular thing. And you can go on all kinds of programs like Coast to Coast and say that, and there's no problem. So I just wonder, this is just me speculating, but if there's some sort of relationship there with some of this stuff.
Now, Michael, there are many scholars, biblical scholars and researchers that will say that Moses, King David, and Solomon didn't even exist. In your research, what have you found with regard to whether they lived or not?
Yeah, I think from an adept occult standpoint, this is all just allegories. I don't think they think any of these people existed. Possibly, I don't know, maybe with King David, like maybe certain characters could be literal.
Yeah.
Some not. So again, this is just sort of like, I don't really know where to go with that. But for the most part, something like Moses, that to me is seen as allegorical. So it just depends on the viewpoint. I can find some parallels with this Davidic bloodline thing, but I'm not saying that's something you can take to the bank and that's what's going on or something.
I don't think they've ever found any proof that King David actually lived. When I say that, folks, I mean, we're talking about archaeology and, people doing that kind of work, that best that I know. Now, if I'm wrong, I know I will get emails.
Well, me too.
But based upon my research, and I did study Christianity for over 3 years, pretty much in depth, King David and his reign has never been proven. So that's why I asked the question. So in any case, I don't want to bog you down here. Just, I guess.
No problem. I'm just saying that's an interesting sort of side note. That maybe people might want to expand on that in their own consciousness and their own information that they've looked at. But basically, if you go on the Orthodox side, David is a Jehovah worshiper, but that's the highest God in their viewpoint. And this is the bloodline that Jesus Christ comes from. And it is literal because Jesus was a literal person.
Yeah.
So I don't know where the literal bloodline stuff, I don't really know where I stand with all that. I just I know that's a very popular topic. So I just threw it out there as sort of food for thought, basically.
Right.
So moving on, this is another huge one, man's divinity. From the adept occultist point of view, man can basically become divine, whatever that really means. I don't know. It seems very conceptual to me, and be greater than the demiurge, basically. And that's the story in the Garden of Eden, right? This is the gnosis given from the garden serpent, the Nakash, the shining one. So you see the shining illuminated serpent. To me, that's the esoteric serpent. That's the good one, right? Telling you, hey, God created you, but there's this whole other realm above him, and he doesn't want you to know that. So if you have my knowledge, basically, you'll be aware of that. And to me, there's something to that because Adam and Eve looks at each other and they realize that they were naked. So that could be, oh, we're material, just like the Gnostics, material is bad. So maybe they are ashamed of that. Like, to me, that could be an allegorical interpretation of that from a Gnostic point of view. But that's one of the, again, one of those passages that's going to go all these different directions from all these different people. But obviously in Orthodox Christianity, we know that to be, the Lucifer, bad Lucifer, the Satan serpent deceiving man, saying you can become greater than God. That created the fall, man's in duality. And, basically the idea in the Orthodox side is man doesn't create his own divinity. There's nothing you can do. It's basically up to God. And from their viewpoint, belief in Jesus Christ is what constitutes your ability to, basically be born again, the whole millennial thing and all that stuff that has to do with being, having your resurrection body and everything that is encompassed in Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, this is a great slide. And it also just shows what a huge divide we have. You could see where those that are involved in the adept occultism, and these would be the groups, the organizations, and the people that are in the driver's seat, if you will. We call them the controllers, the ruling class, the secret societies, and so on. And then you have the right-hand side of the chart, which is where most people, well, I want to say many, many people, that's where they fall, if they fall into any of the Abrahamic religions, as an example, right?
Yeah. And, for me personally, I think that if somebody, there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about the Orthodox Christian side of it, for sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who think like, oh, the Catholicism is Christianity, the Vatican is Christianity. And if you really look at it, the Vatican, to me, is purely adept Gnostic occultism at its stage right now. Now, the whole Templars thing way back in the day where they were trying to infiltrate the Vatican, that's a whole nother story. But so a lot of people will think like, I'll give a perfect example. If you see the movie Zeitgeist,
yeah,
they'll go through all of these reasons why, Jesus is basically the same as all these other deities, right? And, there's some interesting stuff there, but there's actually a lot of things that if you listen to the Orthodox Christian side of it, they definitely point out some holes in that viewpoint. But I'm not saying that these are two perspectives. I think everybody should look at both sides of it and see where things filter out for them personally. So, for example, there's a guy named Chris White. He sort of quote unquote debunks, and I don't like using that word, but he goes through like Zeitgeist and also Ancient Aliens and sort of goes through their research and shows areas where there's other viewpoints. So, if you watch both of those things, I think that that's important but some people will watch one and be like, oh, that's the way it is. But like I said, it's very convoluted. I'm not making it a definitive assessment that, oh, this viewpoint is right. That's not. But, there's misconceptions on both sides for sure. And I think that Orthodox Christianity definitely has a lot of misconceptions from the people in the truther movement that kind of view it as being really terrible.
Okay. Well, we spent a lot of time on this slide, and I'm glad we did because it's a great slide. It's one that I'm going to use as a reference going forward. It's good work, Michael. It really is.
Well, thank you.
Breaking this down. Well, if we go to the next slide, you have adept occultism versus Orthodox Christianity, and then maybe you can help us understand this slide a little bit.
Yes. So basically the idea of Satan or the devil, just basically what is not good, right? What is not true? What is false? What is the wrong way to go to become moving towards God, basically. I just want to show some common viewpoints that both of these share and then go over the distinctions where they conflict. And the reasons why they're common, they vary, and you can just revert to the slide we just looked at for those reasons, basically. But the point is they still view both of these groups as not being good or profane or whatever you want to call it, satanic, whatever bad name you want to give it. This is what adept occultism and Orthodox Christianity views as both being bad. It's the green box. And so basically the common devil to them is Orthodox Abrahamic Judaism. From the Orthodox Christian side is because they don't believe in Jesus Christ. From the adept occultist side is because they worship the demiurge. And then Orthodox Abrahamic Islam, Christianity, same thing. They might like Jesus, but he's not God to them. I haven't really studied Islam too in depth, so I can't really be too definitive on their viewpoints. But to me, that's one of the things. And adept occultism, same thing. They just view it as being the demiurge. Paganism, they both view paganism as bad in terms of nature worship, basically. Blavatsky will talk about paganism in its like pure form, and that's the esoteric form. And, it's kind of convoluted to me there. It's hard for me to differentiate, but basically, to me, the bad paganism is the one that's exalting nature, basically. So worshiping nature gods, you're basically worshiping dualistic gods, right? And so Orthodox Christianity just says that those are demons in disguise. So paganism is just bad all around from both viewpoints on that nature worship level. It's idolatry, basically. And this gets into pantheism. And so I highlighted the word pan because you think of the Greek god Pan, that's a nature god. Now, this is interesting because in a lot of adept occultist stuff, especially Crowley, he talks about Pan a lot. And it's hard for me to differentiate exactly, but to me, from what I understand, Pan is just a nature deity, but it's sort of this concept that's used in alchemical acts and stuff like that. And so in my research in the JFK assassination, also in a 9/11, Pan plays kind of a big role, especially in relation to Lee Harvey Oswald. But we'll save that for another time. But basically, the idea that nature, the physical creation, God is in that, and it's in all of us. So adept occultists would view that as being, well, that's the demiurgic essence of duality, so that's profane. Orthodox Christianity would view it as there's this theme that worshiping the creation, not the creator, that's bad in Orthodox Christianity. And so Jehovah, like I said, is outside of creation. You're supposed to only worship him and not the creation. And, this is the idea that Lucifer or Satan was a created being from that perspective. So that's sort of, along the lines of that. There's also something called panentheism, I believe, and that is different. Whereas they view like the creative universe and the material realm, there's this higher divinity outside of that. And to me, that's more in line with Gnosticism. I haven't really researched that too much, but I just wanted to make the differentiation.
Now, Michael, with Christianity, some arguments will say that the fact that they have saints would say that the Vatican or Catholicism, as an example, is a form of paganism.
Yeah, to me, this is a area that's tough to really decipher. But from my viewpoint, the way I would look at it is that people like, the Vatican or a lot of Catholic churches, like I live in Boston, and they'll have like St. Luke, St. John and stuff like that.
Right.
In my opinion, from the adept occultists, these are initiates who became enlightened. Now, from an Orthodox Christian standpoint, you're not supposed to have saints. That's one thing that might be kind of shocking to some people. Like, you're not supposed to worship man at all. You're not supposed to, you're not supposed to revere Mary like in this deified way. And that's where a lot of the I think the misconceptions on the Orthodox side come into play where, you see Jesus depicted with like a little halo around him, giving some little hand sign, stuff like that. That's a cult. Orthodox Christianity views that as completely blasphemous. You're not supposed to have images of God or anything of a symbolic nature. And I think that is basically the second commandment, no graven images, stuff like that. So they view like all of this symbology as basically being evil and bad. Now, the adept occultism recognizes this second commandment in a way that if you worship the symbol in relation to a physical thing, that's idolatry. But if it's a spiritual concept, that's the only way that man can sort of become cognizant of these spiritual ideas. That's sort of the way I think that they kind of reconcile that.
Okay.
Yeah, like you said, it's, there's a lot of stuff going on with that. But, there's a lot of people in the Orthodox Christian camp that will say like, oh, there's all this Freemasonic symbolism in Hollywood, and it has to do with like movies like Avatar, which are preaching paganism or pantheism. So therefore, adept occultism or Freemasonry is basically paganism. And to me, that's a misconception as well. So one of those things where adept occultism would view an Orthodox Christian saying that as just blaspheming their own God, if you see what I'm saying, because they view Jehovah as basically one of those nature demons, basically, just in duality.
Now, what about a religion that worships, well, I don't even want to say worships. Let's just say that somebody wants to take care of nature, wants to take care of the earth as an example.
Mm-hmm.
So where does that stand? I mean, is that focusing on nature? Is that something that would be looked upon as something you shouldn't do from an adept occultism perspective?
From what I understand, that seems to be the case. Just basically, if you're focusing on that as like being divine, then you're kind of heading in the wrong direction.
So when people talk about Mother Earth and those types of things, a lot of New Age stuff as an example, then they would look at that as you're on the wrong path.
I think that the New Age, in terms of, that modality, what you just said, that would probably be an exoteric from the adept occultism point of view.
Okay.
Now, they might think that they can make that creation better because that's the idea. You're in alchemy, you're uniting the highest essence above the demiurge to the below to for alchemy, and you're basically breaking it down, destroying it to transform it into a new birth, basically. And there's a lot of Hollywood movies that have this theme, like a movie like The Game, I think. Have you ever seen that with Michael Douglas?
No.
Basically, the whole idea is that he's this rich millionaire and he's, all into material things, a lot of money and stuff like that. And it's sort of like a crisis actor movie where basically there's this production company. They put this huge production around him. He signs up for it. He doesn't know what it's about. His brother gets him into it. And there's this weird sort of born again theme where he comes out of a coffin. He's in white. And to me, that's symbolic of like dying your egoic material ego death to be born again. And that's a weird movie with a lot of this stuff. So to me, that's sort of the idea of alchemy, transforming this profane person into something greater. So maybe there's something about the actual nature, because nature, like Aleister Crowley talks about it in relation to Zoroastrianism, which he looks favorably upon, as a fatal and evil force that devours her young. Now, obviously, that has connotations to Saturn, because Saturn is the god that ate his children. And you think like, Mother Nature and Saturn, well, Saturn's a male god, but to me, it's not necessarily about gender physically. It's about the creative essence comes from the feminine. So that's sort of that aspect. So that's just, what I gather from it.
All right, last question. I don't want to bog you down here, but now we've introduced the devil, and that becomes a term that many times is interchangeable with Satan and Lucifer. Now, the devil, if I'm understanding this correctly, is not Satan, and the devil is not Lucifer.
Basically, the devil, from this tarot card's perspective, that is the adept occultist version of the slide before that we would throw into the category of Satan. So basically, everything we're looking at in this green box, that's stemming from the demiurge or Jehovah. So this is like the darkest aspect or element of Jehovah, or the offshoot of him creating the material world. Like basically, this is as low as you can get in materialism. That's what this is a hieroglyph for it. The devil doesn't look like this. This is just symbolic.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
And so this is why the downward pentagram versus Baphomet, who has the upward pentagram, that's the key. It's down into the material, basically.
So when we have Satanists like Anton LaVey as an example, I think you and I talked about Anton LaVey a little bit when we had our call the other day.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about the material world. He's talking about how you should create your existence in the material world. You should enjoy the material. How would you say? Indulgences, lust, money, greed, and so on. Make the most of your life as you possibly can. So, and this card is saying it's essentially you are anchored in the material world.
Exactly. And to me, it's from Anton LaVey's perspective, as far as I know from what I've read, it's just sort of your own egoic desires. So whatever that happens to be, you should indulge in that, and that's okay. And if somebody else doesn't want to indulge in those things, you should respect that as well. So I don't want to like paint him in some awful light, like you have mentioned on the Sophia Smallstorm talk you did about this. When you read the Satanic Bible, it's not overly nefarious. It's not like you're, like you said, you're not, oh my God, this is disgusting. Like, I don't agree with it, but it's just like anybody. Like, I have friends that I like, they have darker sides to them that I don't really participate in. And then the parts that I like about them, that's why I enjoy their company, So to me, it's like, I don't want to demonize that person, but that to me is sort of like that idea, I want to get the girls if I want to, if that's what you want to do. Or it's like, if you want to be celibate and do whatever, that's your material egoic desire, then you can do that. That's right. Sort of like that idea. In my opinion, adept occultism, their idea is that they're in line, or their essence that they're connected with is this will that's higher than their own. And that's the idea of shedding this demiurgic ego or will to the higher will. And that's what Crowley talks about. So this is why when people say, Crowley was a Satanist because he says, do what thou wilt, that's not what he meant by that. And because he has other parts of that, like love under will or something like that. This is the higher idea, the higher concept that's above your human nature. That's what he's talking about. Now, whether you agree that that really is divine or not, that's your thing. But from his standpoint, that's what he's talking about there. So when people think Crowley's a Satanist because he worships material things and like going out and having orgies and stuff, that's not the viewpoint from his writings. Basically.
Okay, right. So you're basically presenting his ideology, if you will. So it's up for each person to be able to do their own research and homework on this stuff to draw their own conclusions. Mm-hmm. Like I said earlier in the show, I mean, you're presenting your research here. And so if this piques people's interest, then they should dig in and they should learn more about it themselves.
Yeah. And if somebody wants to look into Aleister Crowley with a different viewpoint on him, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but Mark Passio is a really good guy who goes into his philosophy. And I think that he lays out Crowley's perspective on things. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's your thing. But to me, that's the more in line with what the guy was actually talking about versus these misconceptions that people talk about him with.
Going back to Anton LaVey for a moment, I did read the Satanic Bible, and one of the things that really caught me by surprise was I was expecting the book to burn in my hands, to catch fire.
Yeah, I know.
And when I read it, what I was reading was really a description, or I even want to say an indictment of society as a whole, the way society operates, basically consumed by the material world. And I'm glad I read it, because by reading the Satanic Bible, I did get a much better understanding of when somebody is called a Satanist, what exactly that means.
The way I would view Anton LaVey, just from a personal perspective, to me, he'd be a very high level of sophistication of this concept. Like you said, I think it's really important to read some of these things and just be honest with yourself when something is really not as nefarious as everybody's made it out to be. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it or think it's good. And this is exactly the way I feel when I read something like Morals and Dogma or Blavatsky. It's like Morals and Dogma, like if you read it, you're not going to get like all of these awful sounding things. There are moments when things pop up where I get a red flag. I'm like, wow, that's kind of weird, or that's kind of a messed up viewpoint. But it's not going to be like, we want to destroy and dominate humanity or anything like that. You know, like you'd like to think like anybody who's a 33rd degree Mason knows that they're willingly worshiping the dark side and stuff like that. To me, I don't agree with that at all. I think that if somebody's a 33rd degree Mason, I don't know why they're that. And I don't judge anybody that is that. Like Manly Palmer Hall, like I didn't know the guy. I'm not going to say he was bad or good. And if I see something in his writings that resonates with me, then that's cool. And if something I'm like, I don't know about that, then I'll discard it. You know what I mean? And I think that if people took that approach more often, they'd probably have a lot less anxiety about it.
Yeah, I've read a lot of Manly P. Hall's work, and to be honest with you, I found it very interesting, very enlightening. So, that's just me. And a lot of people want to ditch Manly P. Hall. They want to say that, he was involved in evil and dark stuff. And to be honest with you, and all the works that I read, and I've read a lot of material that Manly P. Hall had put out there, that I never came away with that impression, ever.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And, who knows? Maybe there was a side of him where he was doing secret handshakes and trying to dominate the world. But like, as far as I know, from an objective point of view, I don't see that.
Yeah.
So why should I make that judgment?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you. I didn't see it. Now, somebody will probably say, well, you didn't dig deep enough, Mike. That's fine. I'm just telling you, based upon my readings and my research, looking at Manly P. Hall's material, I just didn't walk away thinking that he was an evil person.
Exactly. And so, I guess to bring it back to the theme here, basically what's looked down upon by both viewpoints is sensual base desires of man, sexual lusts, materialism, and worshiping nature because it's dualistic, the cycle of death and rebirth. That's sort of like this duality. So that's all just not looked at as being very good by both of these viewpoints, which I think would be surprising for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it will be surprising to a lot of people.
So now the differences, I'll just go over these real quick. These are in the red boxes. So if we go to the left side, adept occultism, they will lump all of this into the middle box, basically. They view this as the devil. So basically Orthodox Christianity, because they think that Jehovah, the Old Testament, is the highest God, and that's the Father that Jesus Christ talks about. So they're just worshiping the demiurge. So there you go. Nothing surprising there, right? And then I have the ignorant masses in here because there's always talked about the ignorant multitude. Albert Pike talks about it a lot. They're the profane. They don't want to seek spiritual things. So, they're going to demonize all these cool people in Freemasonry. And what I think is very interesting when you read through these writings, you see who these people revere. So Albert Pike, for example, he'll revere somebody like Jacques de Molay, the Knights Templar guy who was burnt at the stake, Charles I, who was beheaded. And he has disdain for somebody like James I, who's the King James Bible James. So you can start to kind of get a picture of who they view as being good or bad or enlightened and non-enlightened. So I think that really helps people's idea to shape what their reaction is to all of this. And so the ignorant masses, I just put that in green because, there's passages in Orthodox Christianity where it's like, don't be of the world. Satan is in charge of the world. And that's a whole nother topic as to reasons why that could be. But, basically don't join in doing wrong with the masses, things like that. Like the story of Barabbas is sort of like, to me, an allusion to that, where you have Jesus, who's like the truth, right? And then you have Barabbas, who is the murderer, the liar, the thief, whatever he is. And then the people are given a choice and the people choose Barabbas. So it's kind of like the multitude choosing the lie. What a lot of people omit from this story, because I'll hear this analogy made from esoteric researchers, is that the Pharisees stir up the people to choose Barabbas. So what my viewpoint is, these are the higher ups that are running things, that they know how to manipulate people. They're basically exploiting everyday people who, let's just be honest, like they're just trying their best. Well, a lot of them, I'd say. And they're really just using them. So
Yeah.
I think that's a different route that I take with that, where to me, that's really calling out the people who know what they're doing and know that they're manipulating people versus the people who are the everyday person that, might not believe that, the everyday person that thinks that, terrorists did 9/11 or something, you know what I mean? And so I think the important thing is to have a lot of sympathy and understanding for people in those situations based on that story.
Right.
And this is where I don't like also in the truth movement, where people get really nasty talking about people who just haven't woken up to things. And it's not that you can't be frustrated. I mean, I get so frustrated sometimes, like, oh my God, like, how do people not see this or that? But you got to understand that there's a lot more at play than somebody just being able to just, oh, that's real or not, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good analogy, by the way, with regard to the Pharisees, which would be the priest class in the Bible, right? To be honest with you, I hadn't looked at it that way, so it's a good point.
Yeah, and again, that's just an interpretation. Anybody can interpret that how they want to. I'm just a dude in the world making that connection. Like, that doesn't mean that I'm right or something, but it just what resonates with people, you know?
No, but it's a good perspective. I mean, it's a different perspective, and it's very good.
Yeah, so if we move to the other side of that, the conflicting devil on Orthodox Christianity, they basically view all esoteric doctrine and Eastern religion, because Buddhism does definitely have some ties to occultism, because Blavatsky says that Buddhism, or Tibetan Buddhism, I think, something along those lines, is one of the more pure exoteric religions, because, you know, the idea of shedding your emotions to transcend the material realm and become sort of this androgynous consciousness or whatever, you could see the parallels. So basically Christianity views that as all being bad too. So those are really the two distinct differences, and they're obviously creating a huge polarity between them, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's basically something that I think that maybe some people might be surprised at.
Okay, this is a good chart. Did you want to move to the next chart?
Sure.
Okay, let me get there. There we go.
Basically, this is taken from revelations given by Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma, and this is from chapter 30, called the Knights Kadosh degree, the 30th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And I think this is a very interesting chapter because he reveals a lot in this. And I have a video on my YouTube channel that will be in the links, and people can watch me, you know, kind of go through the reading because it's pretty heavy reading. And so basically he just reveals the enemies of adept Freemasonry. And so basically the theme of this chapter is that Freemasonry uses its enemies as its greatest benefactors. He says that we lean upon that which resists or stand upon it. That's an Eliphas Levi quote. So basically things that resist enlightenment or whatever, like they're going to use that for whatever their purposes are. So these are the enemies. Basically, I mean, this is relating to the slide we looked at before, Christians versus Muslims. Like, the point being here is that these are the groups that are always fighting with each other. That's a huge theme going on right now. You know what I mean? Like, from the idea that the United States is like this Christian nation, right? Whatever you want to think about the reality of that. But, you know, and then we have this so-called like Islamic invasion and, you know, the whole immigration thing. And that's a different topic. But the point is that theme of that conflict is there. And then also we have this other atheism versus Christianity that goes on a lot. I mean, you can go to the countless YouTube videos of people just fighting about this. And then Christians versus pagans. And this is very much in the truth movement. You know, you'll have a lot of people who are Orthodox Christians in the truth movement, but as soon as somebody starts talking about like new agey type stuff, they're going to get really angry about it. And, you know, people on the new agey side are going to be like, well, they're being hateful. So, you know, there's conflict there, right? And then, of course, the Abrahamic versus atheism, where atheism are like, you know, anybody who believes in Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, like that's where all the conflict happens in the world, in the Middle East, right? So that's kind of their viewpoint of it. So everything is polarizing, butting heads on the opposite pillars, right?
So when you say on the chart that Albert Pike says that Freemasonry uses its enemies as its greatest benefactors, are we saying that these conflicts or this polarization, Christian versus Muslim, atheist versus Christian, and so on, that this is actually engineered or manufactured in order for the adept to exalt?
Yeah,
how does that work?
Basically, what I'm kind of getting at is that there's a parallel here. That is there a purpose to having all these groups divided at the moment? And this gets back into, you know, there's a lot of things about Albert Pike's World War III letter that, you know, may or may not be real. I don't even care if it's real or not. But what's very interesting is everything that's in that letter, if some people in the audience are familiar with it, it's basically they'll unleash the atheists and the nihilists to destroy Christianity. And there's going to be all these conflict. You know, it's kind of weird how that's going on. You know what I mean? And this chapter reveals that So is there a purpose to use these people and pit them against each other? Now, you could go into discussions as to what that purpose is. Maybe it's just so that they can get people fighting, and when they're fighting, they're in a lower base level and they can infiltrate something like a government or an institution. And this gets back into the Knights Templar and all these weird things that go along with the JFK assassination that I've looked at with the idea of like infiltration. And that's the story of the Knights Templar. They wanted to infiltrate the Vatican because they believed that they had the true knowledge of the Gospel of St. John, which is basically the Gnostic idea of Christ, their own divinity, their own Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it, their own enlightenment. So that's just the point I make. People can decide whether or not that makes sense to them, but there might be a motive. And the last bit is that they all exalt the physical creation, the demiurge. So if the demiurge is their motivation, we can't have any of these groups in charge for real, because that would just be bad. So we're going to take over and we're going to bring the world to this unity. That will get into the idea of alchemy, which we could get into a little later.
This is crazy. It really is, because I don't even know how to put this into words, but essentially it almost seems to me that what they're doing is they're leveraging the ignorance. They're leveraging the lower level, the profane, if you will, in order to put themselves above it all, to be able to control, to be able to lead, to be able to steer. And a lot of people are going to interpret this as, well, how can that be good?
Yeah.
Right? You're causing all of this strife. You're causing all of this pain. You're causing all of this chaos. Of course, order from chaos, right?
Exactly. And chaos really means the material world, because Sophia, like there's this Sophia chaos idea that she descends into darkness. Well, that's into matter. So order out of chaos is order out of the darkest levels of materialism, from what I would understand it.
So the next question from some of the audience would be, well, why do they even have to go down that path? In other words, can't they just do it without causing all of this ruckus and all this chaos? Or is it that they cannot because there's a protocol or there's a process that needs to be played out in order for them to achieve their goals?
Yeah, that's weird because, when you read the book of Revelation, I think it's important to study it from the Orthodox side. To me, I didn't really understand all of this occult stuff very well until I studied Orthodox Christianity. That really allows you to understand the differences, I think, on some level. That's just my own personal experience. But, from that book, obviously some, to put it not so eloquently, some shit goes down.
Yeah.
And it works on both sides. The world's going to be tossed into turmoil and brother's going to turn against brother, all this stuff. And is this prophetic revelation from God? Or is this, it's so weird because you could be like, well, this could be a blueprint that's followed, but turns into be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
There's all these different weird ways to look at it. So I don't know. But to me, if you just look at the literature, you can see parallels. Now, as to why that has to happen or does it need to happen? I don't know. I mean, that's just way beyond my comprehension as a person,
Yeah.
But, that's just food for thought because, a lot of people have looked at the book of Revelation, whatever context they want to put it in, and they can probably see a lot of the parallels here.
Yeah. Well, then there will be those that argue, Michael, that it's being used as a script. So yeah. It gets very, very complicated.
Yeah. And so, using it as a script, like I said, I mean, that could be in some weird way from an Orthodox Christian point of view. Well, God said it and it did happen. And see, this is the idea. This is the idea that God uses evil or bad for higher purposes. And this is an idea that's in both sides. From the Orthodox Christian's perspective, Satan's allowed to have his heyday and do all this stuff. And you could probably look at it as like, okay, he wants to be the highest God. That's the whole point. I will ascend above the throne of God, the recesses of the north. I think it's very interesting. The north is a direction that is not looked at as good in Freemasonry. Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah. It says that that's where Lucifer, right? The bad one wants to ascend above God. So, you could look at it as like, is this forces, this prideful being that wants to be the highest ruler, his chance to rule and this creation that we're a part of is part of that? Or is there something else to it? I don't know. That to me is a more Orthodox viewpoint, but from a Gnostic viewpoint, they're just completely perverting all this stuff. We have a place in the divine realm, and we're fighting against this corruption. And to me, personally, I kind of fuse these viewpoints together in my own ways. But however anybody else takes that, that's fine with me, and that's sort of like the philosophical end of all this.
Yeah, I think in the show with Sophia, I had mentioned when I did the Baphomet show that Manly P. Hall had said that they are taking divine magic and they have bastardized it and they've converted it to sorcery. I'm just throwing that out there. This is, like I said, a very complex topic, to really try to get your head wrapped around.
True. And what's so interesting about that, I think, is like there's this idea that this deceptive force, like if you think the idea of Satan in Orthodoxy as being the most divine, brilliant, charming, charismatic, intelligent, created being, but it uses all of those attributes for its own exaltation, you could say, well, is this a result of that?
Yeah.
And so, from the Marilyn P. Hall perspective, it's just, to me, again, in the eye of the beholder, what is white magic? What is black magic? How do you define what that actually is? And so that, to me, is where you kind of get your answer for that. But, some people will say the reason they're so close to each other is because that's kind of the nature of what we're in. And maybe our experience in it is we have our free will choice to decide what we think is right and wrong in its methodology. And this is why Orthodox Christianity, they say, well, the Bible is right. And so if you're a human trying to decide what's right and wrong, you're just going against God's will. And that's something that, you could take that viewpoint if you want, but I see a lot of people that do, and they turn into some really nasty, mean people. And I don't believe that,
Yeah, I've seen that too. I've seen that in my own life. This is another great chart because people can kind of get their heads wrapped around the struggles that we're seeing in the world today. And like I mentioned before, the chaos, and maybe, we can get somewhat of a hint as to why it exists based upon that quote that you have by Albert Pike at the top of the chart.
Mm-hmm. And for me personally, this is something that's sort of close to my heart, because what I would like to convey with this slide is that if we're in any sort of these categories on some level, or we know somebody in these categories, if we're all being viewed as the same, as profane, by this force that we can probably all agree in the Truther movement, the controllers, whatever they are, if it's the Archons, Jehovah, or if it's Lucifer, whatever the hell it actually is, we can agree that that's not good. So if we look at all these groups that are fighting with each other, the only way that we're going to have any semblance of creating any true good is to start reconciling some of these stupid things that we fight over. And that's the whole point of why I put this slide together. It's just look at everybody's fighting here, and we're all basically being viewed as idiots for doing it. So shouldn't that be a clue to people that whenever somebody's, on a YouTube video and they're saying, you're preaching a satanic doctrine, you need to find Jesus, blah, blah, blah. Or if you're on the flip side of that and you're saying, well, you stupid Christians don't know that your God is a lie. Like, you're not helping. That's the thing that I want to convey most, because that's the thing that really bothers me when people get really nasty about that stuff and they think that they're so enlightened when they're doing it. I don't think you are. You're moving in the wrong direction, in my opinion.
Are the adepts using the demiurge as a way to foster enlightenment? In other words, I know it doesn't make a lot of sense at face value.
Well, actually, what you said does make a lot of sense, because that is a viewpoint where it's sort of like man becomes cognizant of all of these things through the demiurge. It's really weird and it's really philosophical and it's really complex. And, maybe that's by design, but that is one of these ideas that, okay, this demiurge is this bad thing, but good can happen from it, from the higher level of that. But like I said, you have to figure out what you think about that to begin with,
Yeah, I'll have to ponder that myself.
Yeah, it's confusing for me too. I'm just as confused as a lot of people in all these things, but with all the stuff that the questions that spawn from this that might make people's heads spin, I hope that there's some things that have been clarified that people don't have to worry about so much, No,
I think at the very least, what it's showing is that the world is not this black and white place that, it's not, we have something in a little box somewhere and there's a big bow slapped on it and, and this is how you want your world to be. I mean, what I'm getting out of this is that, as I said before, it's very complex. And, not being in the world of the adepts, all we can do is to try to dig as deep as we can to do the research like you have to see if we can pull out information to make some sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, but it does get to be difficult to do that. And as I've mentioned to many folks many times, Michael, is that in order to get to an ounce of truth, we've got to dig through 2 tons of garbage.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And a lot of times we'll dig into things. I know I have, and I think I'm on the right path. And then I say to myself, you know what? I think I'm down a rabbit hole that I shouldn't be in, and then you got to get yourself out of it. You got to get yourself reoriented and, and then move in a different direction. So in any case, I didn't want to bog you down any further. This is a great slide also.
Oh, just one more point I'll make about that. I told this to you before. I just, if people get confused about this and they get overwhelmed, I just relate it to the movie Forrest Gump, where it's like, Tom Hanks's character, he's this idiot, right? But he does the right thing. He treats other people as you would want to be treated, right? The golden rule, right?
Right.
And all these people who are smarter than him, they screw up their lives. Everything is just chaotic, but somehow they're more enlightened and they're smarter than he is. He's just an idiot. I think that's the premise of Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot. But basically, I think whenever you get overwhelmed with this stuff, just bring it back to just treat people how you want to be treated. And that's the best way to like center yourself back in through all of this,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we can move on to the next slide.
Okay. And this slide says adept occultism at the top.
Yeah, so this is from their viewpoint, as far as I can tell. And just elaborating on some stuff we talked about. We don't have to get too much into this, but the idea of demons, this idea is basically, again, these material desires that create darkness. And so we looked at Anton LaVey, we talked about him just sort of indulging in your own ego, whatever that is. It could be very sophisticated, but you're still just, this is what I want. The middle picture here, I think this is a famous painting, but there's like this weird demonic butt-faced demon thing talking to this Vatican guy. And, this is whatever anybody wants to think about the Vatican, whatever. But the point is like, he's in touch with this higher God. So he's sort of like, it's kind of like, to me, the idea of Satan tempting Christ, because he's quoting scripture to tempt Christ and Christ throws scripture back at him kind of thing. And you can see him looking in the Bible. I'm assuming that's the Bible here. So you can see the parallel there. But to me, this demon thing is just an allegory. It's just a representation, a visual one of man's sinful nature. And it could be maybe perhaps Yaldabaoth, the archons, from that perspective, that the source of evil from the adept point of view. So that's all I'm getting at. They don't think that demons are these entities that look like this, basically.
Okay.
It's just a hieroglyph, basically, like that.
Okay.
And moving to the right, you see a picture of Jesus Christ, and he's casting out the demons into the pigs. That's a pretty popular story in the New Testament. So, from the viewpoint of the occult, he's casting out the base desires, the egoic will into these pigs, and pigs is a, self-indulgent swine kind of idea. So you can see the allegorical interpretation of that pretty well. Above, you have the devil card once again. So just think about it from this viewpoint. It's all the bad stuff that has to do with Jehovah or the dark pillar. And in astrology, if anybody's interested in that, basically Saturn, the moon, and Mars, when those things are, associated with each other and they don't have this counterpart light to it, like the sun or Venus or Jupiter, that would be seen as somebody who might be more prone to bad, destructive, dark behavior. But it's also an idea that from that, they have a greater potential to become more divine by shedding that. That's kind of an idea in astrology and when people analyze birth charts and stuff like that. And I've researched quite a bit about astrology, and that's one area I think that if you look into that, that really helps you tie so many things together, especially events like JFK and 9/11 and stuff like that.
Yeah. Now, Michael, let me ask you this. So hopefully I don't sound dumb asking this question. So from an adept occultism perspective, you have the devil card there and you have Jehovah. the little box to the right. So do the adept occultists view Jehovah and the devil as one and the same?
Yeah, but again, basically it's sort of like the negative aspects that arise from that.
Okay.
And it's this weird idea is that like the material world couldn't exist without bad, and like if evil didn't exist, then it would just disappear. There's all these weird philosophical things going on. So like I said, it's sort of like this is a result of this creation, basically.
Okay.
And this is the darkest allegorical representation of it.
Okay, so the negative aspect of the duality?
Yes, and this is the card for Capricorn. So basically, if you took the sign of Capricorn in the zodiac and you associated all the negative attributes with it, that's sort of where you can go with it, because each zodiac sign has positive and negative attributes with it.
Yeah.
But there are positive and negative signs. So what that means is sort of like if you have a positive sign, like I don't know, let's just say like Gemini or Leo or something. Leo, perfect example. You're supposed to be like charming, very regal. You have a lot of positive qualities. People like you, but you can use that in bad ways. You can have like maybe be talented, but you can use it in destructive ways. Like, oh, I'm a really talented musician, but I only became a musician to get girls kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's like you have positive things that could be used for divine things or good things, or you could go the other way. And then you flip it around, you take a negative zodiac sign like Capricorn, and they're supposed to be like very stubborn, pessimistic, materialistic.
I'm a Capricorn.
Yeah, me too. And so basically you could also have potentials for, really good work ethic and all these sorts of things. So this gets into astrology. I won't get too much into that, but you can see the correlations.
Yeah. Okay. It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. Did you want to move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. This is one of my favorite slides in the deck. So
maybe we can get through this and maybe one more and we can finish it up. But
okay.
So basically the concept of the three pillars, we talked about the duality, and that's the two pillars, right? So you have the Masonic tracing board here, and this is the entered apprentice degree tracing board as far as I know. And then you have the tree of life, and this is Kabbalah, and this is the Sephirot tree of Jewish mysticism. And then I put pillars in behind it so you can see the correlations here. Now, before we get into this, I'll just show you these parallels in, events your viewers will be familiar with. Dealey Plaza, where JFK was assassinated, is actually shaped like the tree of life. And you can see it in that picture. And if you take the streets running horizontal, like North Houston and South Houston Street, what's interesting is you have a North Houston on the left side and a South Houston on the right side, and Main Street is like dividing them. So this is an allusion to the North and South pillars. So Elm Street would be the North pillar, Commerce Street would be the South pillar, and Main Street is the equilibrium or the middle pillar. This gets into my work on the JFK assassination. That's on my YouTube channel, but where he was assassinated and the path of the motorcade has some really weird stuff going on in relation to the tree of life and tarot cards and stuff like that. And I'm not going to get into that here, but basically you can see the connection. And if you look on the tree of life, I know there's a lot of stuff going on it, but you could see a big square. If you take the three spheres on the right side and the three spheres on the left side, you can make a square between them, and then four squares, in between those. And you can see that with the streets on Dealey Plaza. That might be confusing to some people, but...
So you're talking about, now, if we look at the squares on the right,
mm-hmm.
We're talking about the black square, the gray square, I guess that's an orange and a blue, and red and the blue, and the orange and the green?
Yes. So basically from the black to the orange-yellow below it, and then you move over to the green one, and then up to the kind of grayish one, then back to the black. That's a square there, right?
Okay, and so you're saying superimpose that onto Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, and you can see there's pathways connecting each of those three to each other, so they're the horizontal line. So that would be like North Houston and South Houston would be the path between the green sphere and that yellowish orange sphere on the left.
Okay, I see it.
So. And so there's so much weird stuff going on in the JFK. Oh my God, it's crazy. But so you can see that there. Now, if you look on the Twin Towers, the former Twin Towers, you can see that design is built or was built in going up. The three pillars going up, right?
Yep.
So we know that those are two pillars, right? And there's something that needs to be in the middle. And when you look at like the Statue of Liberty in like, a lot of photo shoots or pictures, you'll see her between the Twin Towers. That's sort of like the goddess between the towers. That's sort of an occult motif. Whether people are cognizant of that or not when they photograph it, I don't know. And also there's some photos where you can see like the sun in between the two pillars.
Yeah.
This has direct connections to the Tree of Life. So basically, if you look on the Tree of Life, the middle sphere that's yellow, the more true yellow color, that's the sun sphere. It's sort of right in the middle of all of this. And then you have below it the purple sphere, and that's for the moon. So they're on the middle pillar in between, right?
Yep.
See what I'm saying?
Yes.
So if you take those pictures, you're showing a goddess or like a lunar motif in between the pillars. And if you see the sun in it, you'll see, obviously the sun's right in the middle, illuminating the pillars, right? And I can give you some slides later on to insert to demonstrate this.
Okay. But
definitely some connection. Obviously, just the north and south tower. I mean, it's pretty obvious that these things are connected. So, and then the last one, this is something I just found. It's kind of a loose connection, but in Sandy Hook Bay in New Jersey, like I was saying, I like to sort of scour city layouts and see what I can kind of find on Google Maps. And I found this peculiar design where it's basically the three pillars and there's a long road coming up. And this is in the ocean, so it must be some pier or dock or whatever of some sort. And this is in Sandy Hook Bay. So, obviously that's not where the Sandy Hook event took place, but just by name, that's kind of strange, especially in connection with those other places and the events that have happened there.
Yeah, I mean, this just reinforces the fact that this is just so entrenched. All of this occultism. There was a movie I watched, a documentary, Michael, maybe you've seen it, Hidden in Plain Sight, where I forgot the guy's name, but
yeah, I've seen it, not the entirety. I've watched quite a bit of it, though.
Yeah, and he goes off and shows how everything has been designed and put together based upon the occult. And you're showing it again here. This is just unbelievable stuff.
Yeah, just expanding upon things that, a lot of people have already known. And everything that I'm showing, it's not like anything new. I'm just trying to expand upon stuff,
Well, I've never seen this before, so I find this very fascinating. Now, the middle picture, we have what's it called? Entered Apprentice?
Mm-hmm.
There's three pillars there, and it has the letters S, W, and B. So
yes.
What does that mean?
Okay, so this is not to be confused with the north and south, because on this tracing board, as they call it, you'll see the directions north and south in the blue border. So the left pillar, you'll see the N there outside of the depiction, and you'll see the south on the right side. But the pillars themselves have these letters, and that doesn't have anything to do with the directions. S just means strength, B means beauty, and W means wisdom. So that is not the directional aspect of these things. And you can see the directional aspect outside of it. So basically, if you want to apply this to the Tree of Life, you look at the very top, there's the east, right?
Right.
And this is sort of like the sun rising in the east. That's why it's sort of seen as divine. And then the south, that is the pillar of light. So that's for the divine as well. So the east and the south have divine directions. And this relates to astrology because the eastern horizon is called the ascendant. And then the midheaven, that's where the, solar noon is basically. So when the sun is in the midheaven, it's basically sometime around 12 o'clock, depending on where you are. These are basically directions that correspond to deity because it's the sun rising in the highest strength of the sun. Now, the west and the north, those have to do with earth on some level because the sun sets. And so the divinity is going away. Or with the allegory, it's kind of dying, going into the earth. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that the sun goes into the earth, but you see what I'm saying.
Right.
And then the north is the greatest point of darkness because that is where, at least in the northern hemisphere, right? I mean, so that's when the moon comes out. So on the birth chart, the axis of the horizon, the east and the west, that's like the balancing point between the light and the dark. And then the midheaven up in the heavens, that's like the south pillar. That's the greatest strength of the sun. And that has to do with summers because it's hottest in the summer, or at least where I live. And so, you could see the correlation. And then in the winter, that's like the north. So that's where it's the darkest. And The opposite of the midheaven is called the Imam Coeli, and that's the darkest point of the natal chart. So something around that could be related to darker themes in your life if you're going to look at it from a personal perspective. But it's very interesting on the JFK assassination event and 9/11, specific times of that, the constellation that's in the darkest point is Capricorn and Aquarius, and those are seen as pretty malign constellations. So there's some weird stuff going on with that, but not to get too off topic, these directions have very specific meanings.
Okay, and what about the ladder? What does the ladder represent?
Okay, that's just, basically spiritual ascension, moving up. And you'll notice that the checkerboard, right? Because we talked about how that represents duality.
Yeah.
That's in the West. So that's basically represented towards Earth. And if you look on the Tree of Life, I've placed those directions there. So the brown sphere at the very bottom, that's the sphere for Earth. It's called Malkut in Hebrew. But that's the direction of the West. So now you can see why the duality is placed there. So you can see the connection.
Okay. And then to the right, where you have the Tree of Life, you have some call-out boxes, and you have Crowley, Jehovah, pointing to the blue circle with the S. Yeah. So what does that mean?
In Kabbalah, or Gnostic Kabbalah especially, you place the demiurge at certain spheres. So basically, all of these spheres are planets. Traditionally, there's 7 of them, and in more modern forms, you'll assign Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. But basically, it's kind of like the heliocentric model in a way. Basically, up until Saturn, that's sort of like the realm of duality in a way. And then once you get out into the outer planets, those are seen as only divine. And this is more from an astrological standpoint.
Yeah.
But you need to bridge those things. And this asteroid Chiron is kind of this idea of doing that. But basically, all these spheres are just planets. So, when Blavatsky associates the demiurge or Jehovah with Saturn, that's why I'm pointing to that black sphere, because that's the sphere for Saturn. Now, Crowley talks about the sphere, the 4th sphere. If you go from the top, you'll go down. And again, this kind of gets a little complex, but basically that blue sphere, that's the 4th sphere. And that's where he places Jehovah, because the Tetragrammaton, a 4-letter name of Yahweh or Jehovah, Yod-He, Vav-He, that's his school of thought. And then Jehovah comes from Sophia and Gnosticism. Like I said, she sort of creates the demiurge sort of by accident. So that circle on the right, the kind of grayish one, that's the wisdom circle. So wisdom has to do with Sophia. That's kind of a synonymous term. And so you can see like Jehovah is not at the top sphere. And that's kind of the idea behind it. So you're placing the demiurge on a lower realm. And this, I got to give the disclaimer. There's so many different viewpoints on where this goes. Some people will even place Jehovah at the top sphere, but there's this other world above him. It just gets crazy. But basically, the idea is that Jehovah is not at the top wherever you go. And this Tree of Life can be sort of like this reflection of it.
So, Michael, when we talk about the 7 planets, or I guess 11, I'll say the 7 celestial bodies, I guess, because there's going to be flat earthers listening to this.
Yeah.
How do we count the 7 on the Tree of Life? Which circles are the 7?
Yes. The purple one is the moon. The green one is Venus. The orangish yellow one is Mercury. And the sun is the one in the center, the truer yellow color. And then the red one is Mars. Blue one is Jupiter. Black one is Saturn.
Okay, and the gray one on top right is?
This is debatable, but some people say it's Uranus. Basically, Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune. There's 3 circles. There's one that's kind of hidden behind, and that's called Da'at. That's kind of a controversial thing, but some people place the outer planets at whichever one of those suits them. Aleister Crowley, I believe, places Pluto at the top sphere.
Now, is there a significance to the call-out box? It says Blavatsky, Jehovah, as that being a black sphere?
Yes. Basically, from what I read from Blavatsky, she says that she likes to relate Jehovah to Saturn a lot, and that's the demiurge or Yaldabaoth, whatever you want to call it in Gnosticism. She likes to kind of point that out a lot. And so in the story of the Pharisees in the New Testament, the Pharisees that Jesus Christ is sort of railing against or calling out, those are Jehovah worshipers according to her. So they're like basically worshiping Saturn. So this is where you get a lot of ideas that Judaism is worship of the planet Saturn and stuff like that. And, I don't know, but like that's sort of where that idea kind of comes from on some level, or you can make that correlation.
What about the term the black sun? Does that play into this or no?
Yeah, I don't know. To me, it's sort of like, actually, I can sort of make a connection to that right now since I've already outlined these things. If we go back to the tracing board, you'll see that there's that ladder and there's 3 figures on it. And so the bottom figure, I believe, is sort of the Mercury or Hermes character, sort of who's part of the initiation process, guiding you to this divine knowledge. And so that's sending you up the ladder, right?
Yep.
And then that would be related to the yellow-orange sphere at the bottom of the left pillar, basically.
Okay.
And then Venus is just right across the way in the green pillar, and that's sort of like the green goddess, right? And I already talked about how Lucifer, Sophia, that kind of thing, they're all sort of synonymous with each other. And where you place them on these trees, they just sort of have like maybe possible like higher or lower octaves of each other. And I don't want to get too complicated, but basically you could see the connection, the green and the goddess, right?
Right.
So you're kind of like unifying those two in a way. And then at the top, there's sort of like this woman figure. I can't really tell, but there's 2 children there and she's in a veil. So to me, this sort of relates to the idea of the goddess veiled, like Isis unveiled, things like that. On the Tree of Life, if we go back to the right, there's 3 purple kind of dotted lines going horizontally across. Now, there's different veils as far as I understand it, and you can place them in different areas. These are just 3 that seem to be common to me. One is where the moon is, so that purple sphere, the moon, and like the lunar goddess, right?
Yeah.
That's one veil. And people always talk about the moon having this sort of illusory concept to it. It's an illusion, the illusion of Maya or whatever you want to call it. To me, there's sort of a parallel there. And so you have this goddess figure kind of veiled there. So now you're going through like this first veil. And again, this is the entered apprentice degree. So you're at the kind of the bottom of the chain here. Once you go through that veil, you see there's a sun at the top of the left pillar, right?
Yep.
Now, the left pillar is the pillar of darkness. So you talk about the black sun, right? To me, that's just sort of synonymous with the idea of Jehovah, or specifically Yaldabaoth in Gnosticism, because he's this lion serpent. And Leo the lion, that's sort of the constellation that's associated with the sun. Now, like I said, you can have this prideful quality to regalness where you become sort of this egoic, I'm, hot shit, basically, right? And so this is sort of getting you to the next level in the Tree of Life, where now you're at the sun sphere. And some people place another veil there where it's like, okay, now you're at the sun, but this isn't the true one. This is Yaldabaoth's sun. This is his ego. This is part of you. This is part of your demiurgic, sinful ego. So this is just leading you up to that next sphere above it. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. So are you saying that the black sun has to do with the demiurge?
Yeah, basically. That's just something that makes logical sense to me.
Okay.
So basically, these spheres where you have the green one, the purple one, and both the yellow ones, that's kind of encompassed on this ladder in relation to what I just talked about. Now, whether or not that's the meaning that people are given, I don't know. I'm just trying to make a logical interpretation based on what I know.
Okay. Because I have to be honest with you, the whole concept of the black sun, that's another term that I have seen is just all over the floor. I just cannot seem to get a handle on what exactly does it mean. I could go to any number of websites and get a different interpretation of what that means. So that's why I was just curious as to what your interpretation was.
Yeah, and if you want to relate it to the Jesuits, because some people will talk about like the Jesuits worshiping Saturn or Set or things like that. I don't know about that. I mean, possibly. I'm not in their secret meetings, but
you're not.
Basically, I could look at it from the viewpoint, because like your guests before, Bruce and Jamie, talked about the black pope, the white pope, and they even talked about a gray pope, I think, who was above them, supposedly.
Yeah. And
this is very interesting because you have 3 pillars. There's a black, a white, and a gray one. And so to me, when you have this idea of dealing with the material, dealing with the profane, if you're an adept, you still have to work with the material. You still have to work with Saturn. That's why Saturn's so important. This is the process of alchemy. You have to deal with all this stuff. So this is why people talk about the Jesuits being a function of like the military or something. I'm not super well versed on them, but they're like a military arm or something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that can make sense because Mars is the god of war. And if you see the black pillar and you see the red sphere there for Mars, maybe that's their function to deal with that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they worship it. It just means that that's their job. I don't know. I'm going by the literature and I'm just making what makes sense to me. I don't know if that's what's really going on, but
okay.
If you go to the other side, the white one, think about like Pope Francis, right? He's always dressed in white for the most part. He's like the light pillar. He's the light of the world. Everyone's, oh, Pope Francis is this rock star pope. He's so cool. So he's basically the mercy pillar. He's the one who's going around and washing the feet of the sick, washing the feet of immigrants and giving all these speeches about how, Western civilization is too greedy and corrupt and all this stuff. And like I said, I could do a whole show on the Vatican, but, that's sort of maybe his function. Now, in the middle pillar, the gray pillar, that's the union of the two, because if you put black and white together, it equals gray. So gray is sort of this color of enlightenment as far as I know, or like union, you're unifying the opposites. And this is why certain tarot cards, you'll see the color gray a lot. And that's sort of what it signifies, a unifying of the opposites. For example, to relate it to pop culture, like Led Zeppelin 4, they have like the Hermit, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's sort of an esoteric invocation. It's like they've unified like their best work into one. And the Hermit is dressed in a gray robe. So he's like this wise sage who has mastered the both polarities of his brain or his consciousness or whatever to create like, going to the next level. So to me, that's like Jimmy Page or whoever's behind that's esoteric invocation is saying, hey, you know what? We've completed that process and now we have this union. And, it must have worked because that's a pretty damn popular album.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So to me, that's something you can relate it to from a pop culture reference. But, basically when your guest said that, I immediately thought of this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And you've done a lot of thinking into this, Michael. And, some people can debate whatever, but the thing is, it's going to have to be a pretty intellectual debate.
I'm just trying to be honest about stuff. And I really try not to get caught up on when I have an idea that this is how it is. Like to me, and there's something to this, shedding your ego. This to me is like the real way that I can apply that works.
Yeah.
It's if you have an application about something and you think you're right about it, and then you're presented information otherwise, what do? Do you latch on and be like, no, I was right? Or do you be like, okay, I was an idiot. I was wrong this whole time. I admit it. Now, when you do that, I usually find that you get opened up to this whole other world of things that actually make things make even more sense to you. But if you don't do that, you're going to be stuck and fighting all of this stuff. And to me, that's sort of like this whole debate and the flat earth movement. Like to me, that's like this, I just love observing it from a psychological standpoint, seeing what's happening. You know what I mean? I don't make comments on what I believe about the shape of the earth, but I just find the whole process of it very strange and very intriguing from this standpoint.
Yeah, same here. I try to, at all costs, to stay away from all of the rock throwing and the name calling and all of that nonsense. I basically just take it in. I think the debate, quite honestly, is very healthy for people to be having.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if we're not engaged at an intellectual level, if we're not having debates and we're not philosophizing, then, then it's just, I don't know what it is that you would be doing.
I agree. And to add something before we wrap up, I think that to me, that whole debate, people need to have a little bit more of an awareness of other people's flaws, because this is what happens. People get put on a pedestal. Let's say there's some person, just take any figurehead in the flat earth movement, if you want to call it that.
Right.
And as soon as they get something wrong, or as soon as like there's some dramatic thing that happens, everyone's like, oh my God, like they're dealing with some petty drama. That means they must be a shill. This is shill behavior. And I'm just like, dude, come on, man. People are humans. And I have friends that I really respect and admire, but they have their not so great moments. And I'm no different. I look back at my life and I'm just like, oh my God, I was such an asshole then, like, or something like that. But the thing is, once you realize that, you understand when people are going through things and they may not be having their proudest moments, but those are the moments you need to like be there for them to help them through that. And that's the problem. People are so quick to just alienate themselves from somebody when there's a not so great moment. And to me, that's what really separates people who get it and don't.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. And I'm sick and tired of the term or the word shill. It just gets tossed around these days. I tell you, man, it just makes me glaze over.
And that's why I like you don't allow comments. I think that's a smart thing because that doesn't enable all that stuff. People can be more objective about the information.
Yeah, I don't do it because I just don't want the circus below the video. First of all, my guests come on. They've done a lot of research. Now, you can agree with my guests or you can not agree with them or you can be somewhere in between with them. But they deserve to have their research and their thoughts expressed. And they deserve to have that done without people throwing rocks and getting nasty and getting ugly and trying to detract from the message. That's really what those comments really do. You get people in there that what they really want to do is they want to damage the message of the person that's presenting. Because for whatever reason, it's not their belief system. They don't agree with it. It's not their agenda. I mean, whatever it may be. So I just decided that I'm just not going to allow it. And it's as simple as that. And I've actually received emails where people were very agitated that I didn't allow it. I've had people actually email me, Michael, and say, you need to allow comments on your YouTube channel because I have something to say. I'm like, well, if you have something to say, then go get your own YouTube channel.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a vehicle for you.
Yeah. The people who say, oh, you're all just talking on these YouTube videos. You're not doing anything. Well, it's like, well, you go out and do something.
Yeah, go out and do something. Exactly right. So I don't know. I try to keep myself above the fray. I really, really do. Sometimes it's a little tough. I really have to bite my lip, but I've learned to just stay away from it and just continue to do the things that I think need to get done and not get caught up in all of the drama. So, Michael, again, this has been great. I've learned a lot. So I'll have you come back. We'll do another show or we'll do another show after that. We'll do as many shows as we need to do to get your information out there.
Anytime. I'm usually pretty available, so let me know.
Yeah, and your YouTube channel again, so folks can go there. I know you have a whole slew of videos up there now that have to do with the JFK assassination.
Yes. Schism 206, SCHISM 206. And basically I have it organized into playlists on my homepage. And that's a lot of that stuff is really in depth. So some people might, prefer to go elsewhere, but I have a summarizing video of the JFK assassination. It's called 33 Occult Ritual Aspects of the JFK Assassination. And that pretty much abridges the whole thing. And it's something that, if people watch just the first 15 minutes of it, I think you'll get a pretty good idea of all the things that are involved. I don't expect people to go through the whole thing unless they, really are into it and maybe take it in segments if you're unfamiliar with this stuff. And I'm still learning. I'm just applying what I see. And I hope that this will spark ideas in other people to maybe come up with things that I have no idea about. I never thought about that. That's my whole goal, to have other people be able to sort of flower other ideas that might be helpful to the common man, right?
Yeah. No, it's great work. In fact, I have that video in my queue to watch tonight. If it doesn't get too late, otherwise I'll watch it tomorrow. And I also sent that video, that link off to two JFK researchers, Oli Damagard and Robert Morningstar, who are two friends of mine. So hopefully that they take a look at it because I think it could help them also to further their research.
Yeah, well, thank you. And like I said, I mean, if you also can send an email, just like I said, just watching the first 20 minutes will be enough for a lot of people. And I don't have any expectations that people need to view the whole thing. But I respect Oli's work. I've heard him a lot. Got some very interesting stuff and all the false flag stuff.
Yeah.
And, for me, the esoteric is where I go with because it makes more sense to me. All the logistics about all the people involved in all these events and, who Guy Bannister was and all that stuff. Like, I know about it, but I'm just not good with those things.
Yeah. No, you have a different expertise on a different facet of it, and that's perfectly fine because at the end of the day, we pull it all together. We actually do get to understand the big picture. So But Michael, I want to again thank you so much. And what I'll do is I'll get an email off to you, and we'll plan on doing part 2 probably within the next few weeks, if that works for you.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
All right, Michael. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good night.
Bye-bye now. And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.